Marcus Breen. This is a program where we talk about various aspects of communication and media theory as it's investigated by and researched into people from around the city of Boston. And so tonight we're here again with another identity from Boston. This time it's Nina Huntemann, Associate Professor from Suffolk University. So welcome, Nina.
Thank you.
We're going to talk generally about games and gaming, computer games and gaming. The past 20 years or so of computerization and gaming have been really a substantial era, if you like, in terms of massive growth and interest in the sector. And this kind of area of computerization has a fascinating set of concerns in that it combines culture with new media, with perhaps the technologies of computerization, as well as plenty of controversies. And we're going to probably talk more about the controversies than anything else today. I wanted to also suggest that it's easy to overlook computer games as something that's just done by young people or something that's irrelevant to a large number of those of us perhaps who are in the older generation. But I want to recall a comment from Chris Marker, a French filmmaker, who considered video games to be one of the great inventions of civilization because they enabled human beings to imagine a different reality, and then in imagining that different reality to perhaps think about how we could better society and better all the options. And his film Level 5 was in fact about the possibilities of reimagining warfare or reimagining human interactions. So I don't think it's a bad thing to start with a reference to Chris Marker, who's certainly one of my favourite filmmakers. However, the point, of course, needs to be made, and this is where I want to start the interview and the questions with you, Nina, and that is that it's really a field that's been dominated by men. And let's use that as the opportunity to talk about your work in raising questions about male dominance of computer gaming.
Yeah, I mean, it's been dominated by men both as an entertainment sector and actually even the study of games and game studies has been for quite some time largely a male field. That's also changing. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of reasons for that. I mean, technology sector in general has been for a long time a male-dominated field, and games is a subset of the technology sector. And also entertainment. I mean, if we look at film production, television production, especially at the sort of executive levels, that most film production companies, television production companies, record labels, also have been managed by men. And so it sort of follows along with that. And computer culture itself has been long dominated by and understood to be a sort of male environment.
And does that mean that the ideas have been outside of and moving away from the broader interests or the sort of general interests of society, so that they haven't included women, or have they included women but in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can look at the early history of video games and perhaps up until like the mid-90s and see more games than not that seem to be oriented towards not just men and boys, but a particular focus within that. And I'm talking mostly about aggression, violence, and so forth. But games have always had various different tales it tells. Games have actually always had female protagonists, not very many, but they have had female protagonists in the past. And they continue to have an increasing number of female protagonists. Yeah, I mean, in general, especially if we look at the best-selling games, we can see stories that are dominated by male characters, and that involves environments and stories that are typically understood as male environments. So, for example, war, right? So you have your whole slew of Call of Duty games, games about militarism, dominated by sort of stories about male characters, and in the universe of those games, there's mostly male characters, both as enemies and as heroes. And then sports, NFL is, Madam NFL is one of the most popular played video games, sports games, as is FIFA, soccer or football. And that too, is dominated by male characters, obviously, because it's the male men's soccer that's focused on. So, yeah, of the best-selling genres, those have been male-dominated. But there's an explosion in video game development right now that has a lot to do with changes in technology that have really opened up spaces for not just more female characters, but just more different kinds of stories.
Okay.
Yeah, just stories that go beyond war and sports.
So we'll get to that in a minute. How did it happen to be that you became interested in this area? If it's something that's mostly played by and dominated by men, how does a female researcher enter the field, as it were?
Yeah, I think one of the mistakes that a lot of I should say one of the assumptions that's often made is that that somehow girls or women don't find a way to engage with male-dominated entertainment. I think the same is said in reverse, that men don't find a way to enjoy, for example, traditionally female-oriented media like soap operas, right, or romantic comedies. Well, we know that's not true. That certainly there is cross-gender, interest, and that was me when I was a very young girl. My dad, who worked for a large technology company, had a lot of computers in the home, and so from the age of like 8, my house was filled with computers, and including consoles and so forth. And I took to them. I thought it was super fun. I enjoyed playing Atari and Commodore 64 and Nintendo and so forth. And I knew that it was male-dominated because when I go to the arcade, I would be often the only girl interested in playing, or one of a few. And then as I went through schooling, it was the same. It was the same. I was usually just one of a few. But like many audiences, you find ways to read around or read into your own identity, right, into the storylines being presented to you. And I did the same thing with the characters that I was playing in games. I would somehow find a way to identify with or enjoy the narrative, even if the character didn't look anything like me. But interestingly, when there was a strong female character, I would get really excited about that, because I knew, even before I had the critical faculties to understand, that I knew that seeing myself, and by that I mean my gender, I did not look like most of the female video game characters by far. They're usually hypersexualized, but I knew that just in playing a female character, there was something that was holding me faster. And I became very fascinated by that as I went through graduate school, and learning about critical theory and understanding entertainment as a place where we often play out our culture, and culture is reflected back at us. I became really interested in this question of, like, yeah, I've been a game player since I was a young girl, and have had these moments of identification and then sort of pushing back against the narratives, and really wanting to explore that more, and realizing that what's great about being in media studies is that you can. Right? You can look at those forms of entertainment for a little more in depth.
Sure. And the fact of the matter is that in looking at any number of texts in media in more depth, and certainly then taking on the position of half the population, which is female, clearly, maybe a little more than half the population, one can then be, as a researcher, be encouraged by the fact that there is a continuation of a feminist project about what it means to resist the taken for granted approaches. So is this where you would position your work within the kind of feminist tradition of resisting, let's say, male hegemony?
Yeah, I mean, I would say both understanding the way in which you can exist within power structures that are, marginalizing you in some way. How do you manage that? And then also, yes, how do you resist that or work to change that? Has definitely been what has brought, that's what brought my sort of critical view, or that's what informs my critical view of games, is very much informed by feminist theory. And for me, it goes beyond representation. I mean, representation, media representation is perhaps one of the first ways in which you can look at entertainment forms. So, for example, with games, you look at what characters are there. What do they look like? What is their visual presentation? How many of them are female characters versus male characters are there? What do they do? That's at the content. And I've written work about the characterization of both men and women, femininity and masculinity in games. But I actually became even more interested in those who produce the game. So looking sort of behind the screen and looking at the industry, and how is the industry organized around gender, and how does gender come up if at all. And it always comes up in some way, sometimes more obvious than others. And then also then looking at the culture of players and what are the gender dynamics among players. And that very much is informed by a feminist perspective, in that I'm looking at how gender intersecting with race and sexual orientation and other forms of identification, how they are reflected in and sometimes marginalized or brought to bear in entertainment forms like games.
So it brings to mind the question of moving outside, if you like, of strictly feminist reading. What kind of communication and media theory would you say is generally applicable, or is it pretty much a hodgepodge or a mix of whatever's available in the traditional postmodern sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's been really fascinating about being involved in an area of study that is relatively new, certainly within the canon of media studies, it's new, is that there's a lot of borrowing from media theory. So for my own research, I go back to Stuart Hall when I'm looking at media representation and the power of representation. And then from there, there's been a whole series of game studies, sort of canon developing, those who studied the concept of play and what play means in both identification or development of identity, but also of culture and society. These are coming from humanists. Probably one of the most popular, well-known theorists is this Dutch historian, cultural historian named Huizinga, Johan Huizinga. And he has this idea about play. This is long before video games. This is before computerization, right? Yeah. He's just talking about children's play and adult play and understanding what play means. And from there, the game studies has built upon that. And so moving away from or building upon traditional media theory, you have concepts like when we play, we are working within a structure. So there's a lot of structuralist work there, but then attempts to break from, mess with the rules, like how can I play with the environment that's given me? What can I do here? How can I resist it? How can I go along with it? What are the rewards by going along with it, with resisting it? So you have a lot of critical theory coming into being useful to look at the way in which we understand our play.
Right, very interesting and important to recognise, going back to Chris Marker, that the opportunities for creating incredibly rich and inviting environments in which players immerse themselves, whereby they can imagine new realities, seems to me to be really something exciting about this field and which the research is bringing to the table.
Yeah, and I would say in addition to that, the ways in which games can actually recreate existing structures as a way of kind of reifying that power. So when I look at military-based video games, most of them are not critical of militarism or military structures. In fact, they just sort of reinscribe that power structure and, in fact, the dominance of the West and so forth. And it's a rare game that actually tries to critique or create for your player a different vision. And those that do are fascinating because they're really going against these like long-held understandings about military structures and power. And
do they sell those games? Do they have an audience?
Yeah, so some better than others. There's one out right now that I think is just a fascinating take on the traditional war video game called This War of Mine. And it's told from the perspective of civilians who are trying to survive during a war-torn, their town. And it's, you just don't ever have that perspective. And it's doing quite well. When I say quite well, you have your blockbuster films that just do gangbusters at the theater. Well, you similarly in video games. But then you have some, indie films that can do quite well in your smaller theaters. And I would put This War Is Mine as in that very successful sort of independent project. But again, what it's doing is it's really challenging traditional narratives. And to your point, into the quote that you began this segment with, really asking of players to think in a different way about sort of a human condition of this war.
Yes, well, it is somewhat depressing to have to think that so much of the material is about warfare, and that we are in an international environment where there's so much war and so much difficulty, which we can see with great detail because of the technologies that now make it possible. We can watch people being aimed at and blown to smithereens by drones, and we can go on our desktop and do exactly the same thing in a simulated environment. I've never been quite sure what to make of that synchronicity in our bringing warfare into our desktops.
Yeah, well, there's a really useful sort of term that's taken up by media theorists and game studies folks as well, called remediation, right? The idea of what is happening in that moment where you are representing, remediating the reality in a televisual, or in this case, a play, a full environment. And that has been, that's being excavated quite a bit, that concept of remediation when it comes to not just war video games, but exactly to your point, when the visuals of drone strikes resemble or almost undifferentiated from the visuals within the context of an entertainment form in a war video game, what does that do to the meaning creation happening for the player and their relationship to warfare and the use of force, you know, sort of outside of the game?
Yes, yes. Absolutely crucial questions, I think, in civil society and for civil society to ask, as are the questions about the militarisation of everyday life. I want to return, however, to the question of gender and gaming, and the question is really being prompted by what has been referred to as Gamergate, which launched late last year, which is 2014, where there was significant male resistance in the form of trolling or going after female journalists who criticised some of the male and misogynistic images in games, but also who were seen, just because they were women, as being open to really quite abusive sexist criticism. This then opens up the conversation, I think, with you as to your interest in this as a particular moment in the critique by women of the male dominance of the gaming industry and the games themselves. Where are you on that, really? Can you give us a little description of not only Gamergate, to add to what I've said, but also the entire kind of spectrum now of female resistance, if you like, or women's resistance?
Gamergate is a bit difficult to get one's head around because it, as I like to say, it means many things to many people.
Right.
But that's just to say that it has been taken up by many different perspectives and political agendas. But if you look at its trajectory, sort of where it started, and some of the more vocal, some of those who are among the most sort of attacked online. Yeah, I mean, it's mostly geared towards critics of games, and particularly female critics of games, female developers who are vocal about making different kinds of games for a, not a male audience. Yeah, those are sort of the targets of the attack. I really think it was inevitable. Like, Gamergate to me seems to be the pinnacle of decades of a very male-dominated industry that to some extent didn't grapple with gender in a constructive way, and was able to, for years, sort of get away with, because the male market for games, and I just don't want to say male market, a very particular action-oriented male market for games, was lucrative. There was almost in some ways, no need to investigate other markets because there was plenty of money to be made there. But as people's time has been, distracted by other things, but then also, startups or disruptors like Zynga come in and say, oh, look, there's this whole other market for games that are not on traditional consoles, and that it's not your traditional, young 18 to 35-year-old, male gamer. It has kind of shaken the industry up and said, there's more that can be done here, and there's a lot of interest in that. And for reasons that subcultures often feel that they're being beset by mainstream, I see within Gamergate, I see a traditionally marginalized, and when I mean marginalized, the wider mainstream culture has not been kind to gamers for the past 30 years, right? Sure. Often accusing them as being, aggressive in real life, that video games make you violent, threats of censorship of games, or at the very least banning games from being sold in certain venues. So with that history, here comes this very mainstreaming of an entertainment form. as well as vocal critics of, you know, the representation of women and of violence. And so there has been a backlash within certain parts of gamer culture. And that backlash has led, you know, and has sort of coalesced around this idea, this hashtag that is Gamergate. And I honestly think it was inevitable. I mean, I don't know it's inevitable that it was going to be called Gamergate.
No,
you know, obviously, that came out of the minds of an actor, actually. But I think that that this was going to come to a head at some point, because the industry is going through a significant shakeup because of the new platforms you can make games for, because of the interest of developers of making different kinds of games, and because there is a whole new influx of players who want to play games.
Right. And my understanding of the women who have been particularly attacked, if you like, in the Gamergate situation is that they've been very effective in and assertive in pushing back, in making very clear claims about their criticisms of the games and their freedom, if you like, to have a space in which they should be free to play and enjoy the same things as the men.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And that some of that criticism has existed for a while. It's just that we're at a moment when it's being given a louder voice, and I think also taking on, you know, using popular forms like Twitter and YouTube to really sort of popularize those criticisms.
And that's a significant change, I think, too, to any popular debate now in the last, I guess, 5 years or so. What we see now are public debates and discussions in media taking place entirely in social media spaces or in media spaces, maybe associated with the games, maybe associated with Facebook, but operating through Facebook, through photography, images, listings of sites on Twitter. It's quite amazing, isn't it? Big change.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I wouldn't call it an organized movement, because oftentimes it's not organized whatsoever. You know, those who are resisting, as you said, sort of women and their allies who are resisting the misogyny of some parts of gamer culture are not necessarily organizing in a traditional sense, but by existing in these spaces and finding each other and sharing perspectives and views, it is creating a sort of a movement, and one that has some. Again, like I said, is much louder than it used to be. And I think that's also the case on the Gamergate side, right? Is that there has been, I mean, I've been playing games for 35 years, and there's always been some very vitriolic and hateful spaces in which you can play games, and players who are quite clear about how they don't want women, gay people, sometimes people of color in those spaces.
Really?
Yeah, and so tools of the internet allow them to find each other as well, right? Even if it's not, you know, organized in the way we would traditionally think, but those spaces allow these groups to find each other.
In some respects, it's quite terrifying to think of how what I consider the unregulated space of the internet becomes a node around which unregulated speech and unregulated behaviour, hateful behaviour by any other name, takes place and is potentially organised. And I don't think we have a good handle on that at all in terms of either theory or practice and how to respond. So that brings us to perhaps our last point, which is regulation. What's happening with regulation in gaming? It varies from place to place, I believe.
Yeah, quite significantly in the United States. A couple of years ago, the Supreme Court sort of finally laid down the law that video games are in fact protected speech, very much like films and comic books and books are. And that was very important for the industry, because it had been battling since the early 1990s threats of government regulation, censorship for years. And they instituted self-regulation, very much like, again, in the U.S. film and television. And so when that sort of final decision by the Supreme Court said, yes, video games are protected speech, to some extent, I think it was a nail in the coffin, if you will, of that argument. Certainly, parents, consumer groups, you know, are still concerned about the content of games, but it's going to be very difficult with that Supreme Court's decision to regulate them in any sense. But other countries have very different policies on that. I know, for example, in Australia, there are regulations on content in games that you would not be able to pass here in the United States. Same thing in Germany. Yeah, and so that still looms over the industry, particularly for the U.S. industry for its foreign exports. But
Sure.
in the U.S., it really sort of got protected or got that final decision it wanted and needed with the Supreme Court decision.
Right, and I suppose it also adds up to making some distinctions even in the globalised context from games being universally absorbed and accepted, where there are very, very clearly still national boundaries and differentiations between what might be tolerable, let's say, from a formal or legal level in Australia or China or any other parts of the world, Western Europe, compared to the formation within the free speech approach in the US.
Absolutely, and there are entire teams in video game development companies devoted to localization.
Oh, is that right?
Oh yeah, and localization is often about grappling with exactly what you're talking about. What are the national expectations and boundaries of what we can say and do, in addition to making sure that there's cultural, that there isn't cultural dissonance in the game, you know, that there is translation, if you will, that fits with the player in whatever country. Yeah, that's a very serious concern, and a lot of resources are put towards it.
Is it likely, just in conclusion, that the amount of activity associated in the research community around computer games, gaming generally, will increase? You know, courses and graduate work?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that's been quite interesting for an academic studying games that Gamergate has actually brought to highlight that there needs to be more research into this area and real understanding about games as an industry, as a cultural product, and so forth. So yeah, and that's really exciting for those of us who've kind of been here toiling in this, you know, in the shadows of media studies for a while, to see game studies becoming quite more significant.
Sure, and of course, as games become more ubiquitous on handheld devices and everywhere, and as do, I guess, what we call deeply immersive digital and video environments, it's inevitable that we'll have to have more and clearer understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, imagine it's a lot like how people didn't take television and film very seriously for a long time, and now, of course, we would never question the importance of understanding those forums, and this is video games moment.
Great. Well, with that, we'll say thank you very much, Nina, for a fascinating and exciting conversation. So that's it for us. Thank you for watching, and until next time, this is Marcus Breen saying good night.